After this new defeat, American ships will hardly dare to face the Japanese fleet again. With this phrase, Adolf Hitler referred to the Battle of the Coral Sea, magnifying the figure of his Japanese allies. This carrier battle was part of a series of crushing victories achieved by the Japanese Empire in the early months of the Pacific Theater. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, which today is remembered as a mistake that brought the United States into the war, the advance of the Eastern forces was basically unstoppable for the Americans. The Philippines, Malaysia, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, and much of New Guinea fell to the Empire of the Rising Sun in a few months. Although the Battle of the Coral Sea was a new Japanese victory, there was a serious mistake by the Japanese High Command that had, in hindsight, a very high price and, in the long run, the result of the battle led to enormously favorable consequences for the Allies. But how did this confrontation unfold, and what was the huge Japanese mistake? In the next few minutes we will tell you all about the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first aircraft carrier battle in history. Are you ready? Let's get started. In early 1942, after a string of resounding victories that allowed the Japanese Empire to take over much of the Far East, Japanese generals began to have a series of discussions about what their forces should target next. Some indicated India or Australia, while others even suggested going all the way to Hawaii. Finally, after 2 weeks of deliberation and seeking not to lose momentum, they decided to invade Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, and then continue with Samoa, Fiji, and New Caledonia. With this intention, they launched Operation Mock, which consisted of landing troops in Port Moresby, completely taking over New Guinea and in turn putting Australia at risk. Under the command of Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, the Japanese forces assembled 23 ships for this operation, including 3 aircraft carriers, 6 cruisers, 7 destroyers, 7 submarines and an oil tanker, in addition to 147 aircraft as an embarked air fleet. For their part, the Allies managed to intercept and decipher several enemy messages to learn of the offensive in time. Although the location of the attack was not specified, Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the U.S. Far East Fleet, deduced that Port Moresby was the logical target. To combat the Japanese advance, they also gathered 23 ships, 21 American and 2 Australian. Among these were 2 aircraft carriers, 6 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and an oil tanker. Regarding the embarked aviation, 36 fighters, 22 torpedo boats and 70 bombers were mobilized, for a total of 128 planes. During the first days of May, the 2 forces and their aircraft searched extensively at sea, without crossing paths, despite being only 100 kilometers apart at one point. Finally, on the morning of May 7, in the Coral Sea, the battle began. Almost simultaneously, aircraft from both sides detected enemy boats. Japan attacked first, with 10 precise 250-kilogram bombs completely destroying a destroyer and the oil tanker. In response, U.S. bombers managed to shoot down 5 enemy planes and subsequently sink a Japanese light aircraft carrier. This first part of the battle continued with Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-21 bomber attacks that failed to cause significant damage to the American fleet. On the contrary, the Allies managed to shoot down at least 5 of these planes with their anti-aircraft guns. During the night of that same day and in the middle of a violent storm, 27 Japanese planes led by the most experienced pilots in night operations were sent to attack the enemy forces. 20 of these were lost, either destroyed by the Americans or crashed while attempting to land. The next morning, the fighting resumed. Both parties quickly located each other thanks to the work of their planes. Around 120 ships took off from each side's aircraft carriers. This was an extremely messy fight riddled with tactical errors. As this was the first carrier battle in history and the first naval engagement where the ships did not see their enemies directly, lack of experience played a big role. Many aircraft lost their comrades and then made staggered or isolated bombing raids, attacking many ships simultaneously, which greatly undermined the effectiveness of the offensives. Despite this, the Japanese attacks managed to be considerably more incisive, causing the main American aircraft carrier to sink. At the end of this new day, the United States and the Allies were left in a position of extreme inferiority, disordered and without any relevant unit to face the invaders. It seemed that Operation MO would be a new success for the Japanese Empire. However, that day fate smiled on the Americans. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue made a huge mistake. Believing that the Americans were far more numerous and powerful than they actually were at the time, he ordered a retreat into Micronesia, calling off the operation for fear of defeat. In short, the Battle of the Coral Sea left Japan with a balance of a light aircraft carrier sunk, more than 900 dead and at least 77 aircraft shot down. For their part, the Allies lost a destroyer, an oil tanker, a modern aircraft carrier, 70 aircraft and 660 men. Although the confrontation was a new blow to the expectations of the American fleet that once again showed serious flaws in organization and effectiveness, the result was incredibly positive in perspective, since they managed to avoid the fall of Port Moresby. As usual, both sides claimed victory. The New York Times even announced that more than 75% of the Japanese ships present in the battle were sunk or damaged, while the Japanese press spoke of the panic present in the US Navy. Shortly after, the Japanese Empire made a land attack to conquer Port Moresby that would lead to the Battle of Kokoda Road, in which the Allied forces prevailed. At the same time, the ability to intercept enemy codes and messages would remain a constant that was absolutely critical to the United States, not just this time, but throughout the war, and especially in a very close and momentous engagement, the Battle of Midway. There, the United States would demonstrate how wrong Hitler was with his statements after the combat in the Coral Sea. We have reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think that if Japan had not made this huge mistake, the result of the war in the Pacific would have been different, or in any way the United States would emerge victorious? Leave your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history. Thank you very much for joining us until the end. And stay tuned for our next video.